Ladies and gentlemen, James Yoxall.
Thank you. I've been told I have to stand here fixedly, so if I'm not walking around, that's why. So my understanding is, so as Vic said, this is the first in a series exploring questions rather than necessarily providing definitive answers. So Agile business change, what does it mean? Why might it be a good thing? When and where is it applicable? And what kind of practical experiences are there that validate these kind of answers? So I'm going to start off. There's two parts of Agile business change. There's Agile and there's business change. And my background and credentials for speaking here are 30 years IT experience. So IT, not business change. 13 years of Agile experience. And I'm one of the co-founders of Indigo Blue, which is a management consultancy specialising in Agile. And the kind of things that we do, just to give you a context, is help companies adopt Agile that have never done it before. More often these days, most companies have done some form of Agile before in some context, and it's about helping them recover the situation or improve the situation. So they've tried Agile, they're not really kind of getting the benefits that they were originally expecting. And the other thing we do is we do help delivery of large-scale Agile programs. And large-scale Agile programs are typically tightly linked with business change programs. And finally, a sort of headline thing is we've developed a number of advanced Agile techniques, in particular a governance framework, which is beginning to be rolled out, just starting some work with the Home Office next week, in fact, to start evaluating that framework from a government perspective. So we don't just do Agile, we kind of like to believe that we add to the understanding and on the frontiers of what's going on. So that's the Agile credentials. Coming to the business change, I think it's reasonable to start off by saying that Agile is something that comes from IT. That isn't to say that Agile is specific to IT. Some bits of it are, quite a lot of it isn't. That's kind of fundamentally what I want to explore today. So one question on the table is, if you take this stuff that works in IT, and we get to understand it better, then we can examine how it might work in other situations, other disciplines, business change or anything else. But the other key aspect, and I suspect possibly some of the reasons why people are here today, is that those people who have been doing Agile in an IT context constantly keep coming up against a problem. And the problem is that IT exists in a context. You can't start changing the process around something in the middle if the bits around the outside aren't changing in some way as well. And so what we kind of find in the general case, and certainly what I find, is that we start getting into situations where, from an IT perspective, where we have been commissioned to come in and change the way that IT is delivered, we start then having to influence, and I use the word advisedly, influence the business change side of things, and start telling them how to do their business from an IT perspective, which is a little bit of the tail wagging the dog. And to do that, we've had to start creating a language and a way of understanding Agile that speaks not just to IT people, but to business change people as well. And so the kind of key messages from today are the end product of that journey so far. And I think the final point there is that the standard Agile stuff that you pick up off the shelf and read generally does not have those answers. And it will become clear why that is as we go through. So the bottom line is, I'm not standing here in any way trying to pretend to be a mega business change expert. And I will be as interested as anyone in the discussion afterwards as to how this can apply in the wider context. So I've got a pretty simple agenda, really. One is, to investigate what Agile is. And the answer is hopefully more complex and more interesting than you're possibly thinking, sat there to start with. And I want to do it in two parts. The first part is to give a relatively standard answer, the stuff that you will pick up if you go and go to books and websites. And then I want to give you the additional insights that I've talked about in the introduction. The second part then is to look at the applicability of that to different situations and business change in particular, and look at some specific experiences and how we've dealt with some particular issues. I think, broadly speaking, got roughly an hour for the presentation and then some questions. I'll try and keep it a bit shorter than that if I can. So, what is Agile? So let's deal with the really easy stuff first. I'm assuming there are some people in the room that are potentially not familiar with Agile at all. I won't ask you to put your hands up. So I'm not going to spend long on this, but it's basically an umbrella term. There is no Agile process out there. There is no process whose label is Agile. It is a way of thinking about, it's a sort of principles that underline a number of specific processes. So in the same way that there is no process that is waterfall, there are a number of specific things that adhere to those principles, exactly the same thing. There used to be lots and lots and lots of examples when we started doing this slide. But it's actually narrowed down, and even putting extreme programming on there, I suspect quite a lot of people haven't heard of it. It's kind of fallen out of favour. The two definitive answers at the moment, certainly in the UK, are it's Scrum or it's DSDM. Right? But the point being that there are many examples that adhere to these principles. And if you go on any presentation or any course about Agile, the first thing that anyone will put up is the Agile Manifesto, which is basically a bunch of people getting together, the people who'd invented these various processes, and trying to understand fundamentally what they agreed on. What were these underlying principles? And this is the set of things they came up with. And I'm not going to go into that in detail, right, because I'm going to talk quite a lot about what the underlying principles are. And to a certain extent, these are very useful and very valuable. And to a certain extent, they're quite misleading and problematic. And I'll point you to the problematic things to start with. Working software over documentation. Right? So the number of people who've gone, Agile means no documentation, drives me nuts. Right? That's not what it means at all. And the other one is responding to change over following a plan. The number of people that said, we don't do plans in Agile, drives me even more nuts. And I will make it clear that hopefully the people who wrote that didn't mean that either, and make it clear what they did mean. But if you go into any Agile universe, this is the first thing you'll see. So that's the easy bit, right, at a very headline level. The next thing I'm going to talk about is some fundamental mechanics. So again, if you were to go into, if you go into a Scrum course, for example, this is a summary of what you'd learn in 2 days. And if you went into an Agile organisation and asked most people what Agile is, this is most of the answer you would get. So 5 things, pretty straightforward. So the first is one ordered list of things to do. Right? Its name in the vernacular is a product backlog. That comes from Scrum. Not very profound. It's prioritised, broadly speaking, in terms of business value. So you do higher business value stuff before lower business value. The things on it we want to be relatively small, and by that I mean, broadly speaking, a few days each, that order of magnitude. Those things, in case you come across terminology elsewhere, are generally known as stories now. There's reasons for that. I'm not going to go into them. The key thing is that it's dynamic. Yeah? You will not have the definitive product backlog at the start of the project that's going to carry you all the way through the project, as you would expect to have on, say, a traditional waterfall project where you've got a Gantt chart, for example, which shows all the tasks on the project. It might have some detailed tasks for the upcoming few weeks, and then beyond that, sort of bigger things that still need to be refined. Things will chop and change and move around, and that's the essence. So that's the essence of how the whole thing works. So it's very dynamic. So that's item one. So I've got an example of one here. Not very profound. It's a list of things. There are some estimates against them. There's a kind of a bit of a description. Yeah. The second thing you have are iterations. In Scrum they're called sprints. The two words mean the same thing. Iterations are time boxed. That means you define at the beginning when they're going to end, and that doesn't change. If you haven't finished the work that you plan to complete, then you haven't finished it. They still end. What's the point of them? The point of them is to provide a heartbeat to the project, to provide a way of measuring how fast you're going. So we start doing things like measuring the velocity, right? How many of those stories you're completing. A scale for their size. That's your overall velocity. Start talking about doing 25 units of work per sprint. Within each iteration or sprint, there's a well-defined ceremony. So we can look at that quickly. Broadly speaking, you start each sprint with a kick-off, where you discuss the totality of what you're going to do in some form. That's a few hours. Then you go away and do lots of these individual stories, and then you get to the end of the sprint and you demonstrate, accept what you've done in some form, and you review the process that you've been following. Right? And then you do it all over again. And then during the course of the sprint, there's a daily ceremony as well. You're doing daily stand-ups called scrums. Lots and lots of Agile projects have defined themselves as being Agile because they do a daily stand-up and not much else. It's another amusing one. So the significant thing about these iterations is the focus on closure. We want to get to the end of an iteration with a bunch of closed stuff. Actually, you can focus on closure without having iterations because you focus on closing stories as quickly as possible. But this is a particular way of adding additional impetus. That demo, for example, is a way of saying you can't just be lax about this. We're actually going to show this to some real people out there, and it needs to be complete. The third thing then is a concept of collective ownership. And what that means is that we have a team of people working on stuff. Some of them might be developers, and some of them might be testers, and some of them might be front end and back end, and some of them might be this, and some of them might be that. Don't care. I'm not interested in those role definitions. And what we're really specifically not interested in is the handoff when, say, a developer has finished a piece of work and hands it on to a tester. That kind of, I've done my bit, it's now your problem, shouldn't exist. We want to get rid of it completely. So if you take Scrum as a specific example, it defines only 3 roles on the entire project. One is the team lead, known as the Scrum Master. 2 is the business owner, called the product owner. So the person who fundamentally owns the deliverables. And the third role is the team. Now that's an ideal that we're trying to seek. Life is more complicated. We understand that. But that's what we're trying to achieve. The fourth thing is we are going to continuously have a complete system. Right? So what I mean by that is, and this is going to be interesting when we start translating it into other kinds of things that aren't software systems. What I mean by that is, in a traditional world, we don't care about that. What we do is we go away and build lots of little components, and we complete them, and then we try not to touch them again, and then we start assembling them, and we go through an integration phase. Right? On an Agile project, we integrate continuously. What that means is we get as quickly as we can to something which constitutes a complete system, some small end-to-end piece. We wrap it in tests, we can demonstrate it, and then the next thing we do is add something new to it. So we take something which is working and tested and complete, and the first thing we do is break it, and then get back there again as quickly as possible, and get back there again as quickly as possible. Yeah. And the final piece is that because we're doing these iterations and we're going around and doing the same thing over and over again, we have an opportunity. And that opportunity is to keep looking at what we've done and how effectively we've done it, the quality of the product that we've produced, the productivity that we've achieved, and keep thinking of ways of improving on that. Yeah. And that's an endless and ongoing process, because the optimal situation will vary over time. It will vary from project to project. It will vary on the same project at different points in time. People's knowledge and skills and behaviours change as time goes on. They learn to work together differently and more effectively. And as you do that, the process can be modified. Yeah, so we keep doing it. And that's it. 5 simple things. Well, doesn't sound so significant. So the first challenge, that is, well, that's all very well, but that's not really an end-to-end process. So at the point where you start, so each of these boxes here is one of these iterations or sprints. Before you start the first one, don't you have to do some preparation? And the answer is obviously yes. Right, and this is one of the biggest question marks in the Agile world, is how much work and under what circumstances do you do in that box up front? It exists. It exists and you're doing 3 things. First of all, you've got to produce the product backlog, or at least part of it, in order to be doing something useful. The second is you need to do some preparational stuff. Before you start building something, you're going to have something to build it on, environment and so on in which to exist. And the third thing is you need to do some design work, maybe, big picture stuff. And the general advice is you need to do a sufficiency, right, which kind of begs the question of what does that mean? How do you test whether or not you've done a sufficiency of design work? Yeah. So I'm going to look at those questions, but the critical thing is this. Right? An Agile project does much less upfront work. It starts attempting to deliver real working solution, and if it's software, then working software, as soon as possible. It delays delivery of real value for as little as possible. So it's striving continuously to deliver value as soon as possible. So that's at the beginning. What about at the end? Right? So if we're delivering value, does that mean we have to deploy something every one of these sprints, for example? No, because if we don't deploy it, there's no value. And in the ideal case, the answer would be yes, because that is how you realise value. But again, the real world is not quite so accommodating. So there are situations, if you've got a website, for example, you can churn out updates on a weekly basis, go through a full end-to-end cycle, and expect your users to accommodate that degree of change. But if you're dealing with business systems, right, you cannot dump new changes on people every 1 or 2 weeks. You can't retrain them. You can't. There's all sorts of stuff you can't do. And if you work in certain kinds of environments where you've got old COBOL mainframes, for example, you are not going to go through a full end-to-end process once every few weeks. So you start having to batch stuff up and do sort of final pre-release stuff on a less frequent basis. Yeah. So while there are these, in the general case, you have these iterations where good stuff is happening. It needs to be topped and tailed. That's the headline message. So what's the big deal? What's so profound about all of this? Why are we all sat? If that's all Agile is, why are we all sat today kind of interested in it and thinking about applying it to other things. And that's where it starts getting interesting. And this is not an exhaustive list at all. So, one thing that immediately comes out is this focus on closure. There is a tendency in a more traditional world to focus on keeping as many plates spinning in the air as possible, focusing on keeping people busy, idle hands, all that kind of stuff, opening stuff up. In Agile, we want to close stuff down. We want to work really hard at closing stuff down. Quite often that means things that seem bad to start off with. One of those is rework. Right? We're going to do something, we're going to close it down and make it complete, and then we're going to go back and add to that. Right? And people have a tendency, a natural tendency, to want to go, well, if I know that that thing over there is happening, why don't I do that at the same time as well? Yeah? Why don't I do a little bit more and it'll be more efficient, won't it? Yeah? This rework is a bad thing. Rework is not inherently a bad thing. Too much rework is a bad thing, for sure. Depends how costly it is. So, one of the first inherent emotional things that people have to learn is that doing something and then going back and modifying the thing you've just done is not a bad thing, inherently. It's getting the balance right. The other thing, so this applies in the software world, but can arguably apply in other worlds as well. Each time you close things down, you've got to test it. Right? You've got to be sure that the totality is working. And once you've done that, and then you immediately break it again, you've got to test it again. So you're fundamentally building into the process lots and lots and lots of regression testing. And that can be very expensive and be scary for people. So that leads on to the next thing, which is what we then have to do is to start thinking about cost of change. Right? Now the standard cost of change argument goes like this. It's very expensive to change something, therefore I would like to change the way that I plan the work, please. That will happen, deep technical IT stuff, but it happens in other situations as well. Right? So I've had that conversation about training, for example. I've got to write all this training material. It's going to take me a long time to do it. And then while I'm doing that, you're changing the screenshots, the screens that I've taken screenshots of, and you're changing the functionality, and you're doing all of this kind of stuff. And that's very, very expensive for me to go back and change. So I would like you to be more fixed about exactly what your final deliverable is going to be, so that I don't have to take the cost of changing my training material. I only have to do it once. I want to avoid rework. The challenge there, as in any of these situations, is to say, well, hang on a second, before you make me change the process, can you think about how you can make change more cheaply? Right? And it's quite interesting. With training material, screenshots, stuff like that, well, we've got automated processes for testing, so can we use those same automated processes for running through a definitive set of scenarios automatically? We've done all of that kind of stuff. Suddenly something that took someone months and months to do, we can repeat it overnight easily. So as you change the cost of changing something, as you reduce the cost of changing something, the process that you can follow, the amount of rework you can absorb, etc., starts changing as well. So there's a very, very direct link between cost of change and the process that you can use. In software terms, it's kind of quite nice and easy because software is inherently soft and therefore, in principle, easy to change, although you can do lots of bad things that make it hard to change. And one of the things that's happened in the last 10, 15 years is a whole bunch of new advanced engineering techniques that suddenly made people not scared of changing things, removed the fear of change that previously existed and drove the process. So sometimes people ask, what's the difference between Agile and all the RAD processes that went before? And the answer is, excuse me, The answer is not very much. It's the cost of change that makes it possible to do all of that and lots of other things as well. The next thing is the concept of avoiding forward investment. Yeah, so that's a nice little tagline. What does it mean? If I've got a list of things that I'm doing, like that, I could be doing the third thing and look down at the 10th thing and go, I could do half of that at the same time. Yeah? I'm not just going to design this thing to deal with the thing that I'm trying to deal with today. I'm going to make it much more generic so it deals with all these other things I can see coming down the line. Yeah, because that seems quite efficient, doesn't it? The problem with that is that what you want to fundamentally be able to do, if I can just flick up to here, so I can't turn around and point at anything. What I fundamentally want to be able to do is to start working on this list, work through the first item, the second item, the third item, right? And then I want to be able to re-examine the situation. I want to be able to think about what's happening in the context of my project. I want to be able to get feedback from the things I've done and the users I've put it in front of. I want to be able to do all these kind of things and then completely change my mind about what I want to do next. Yeah, and go off in a completely different direction. Or maybe just change things around a bit. Now I can only do that if I haven't invested in lots of these other stories that I haven't yet started. Because if I have, I'm back in a traditional situation where in order to make a change, I have to do an impact analysis. Where you'll get a little bit of this budget back and a little bit of this budget back. But those numbers on the right-hand side, right, those are budgets in effect. Yeah? I want to know that if I decide not to do that 20-point one, I get those 20 points back and I can use them to do 20 points worth of something else. Right? That is the absolute essence of how Agile works and why it's beneficial. Yeah? And it only works if you don't forward invest. That's hard. Yeah? So what that fundamentally means is that we have to adopt an approach called emergent design. Right? And what that basically means is that as we open a story, we understand the full impact on all the design elements of the solution as it stands to date, and modify those, and move to something else which is complete and self-consistent, right? But it takes on board new design elements. Right? Now, we can think about that in code terms, probably not very interesting to this group, but we can think about it in terms of user interface design, for example. Right? If you've only got 2 or 3 elements of functionality on the screen, you can have a relatively simple user interface. But as you start adding more and more to that, you have to start revisiting the decisions you've already made, right? And allowing those new things to start driving new design elements. Yeah? Now, at one extreme, you can do all of your design through emergent design. Unfortunately, that doesn't always work. It's a balancing act again. You have to do a certain amount of big picture, broad brush, these are the complicated things, these are how I'm going to deal with them up front, or at an appropriate time, and then allow the emergent stuff to happen on the things that are less important. Yeah, so one of the significant ways that an Agile project can fail is relying upon emergent design and then hitting the big thing that blows the project out of the water because you haven't thought about it in time. The other headline thing is that because you've done less thinking about the project as a whole in the beginning, before you started work, you're basically carrying that decision making into the project. Yeah. You are putting in place a process of ongoing decision making. Yeah. That's fundamental. That means you have to set up mechanisms whereby decisions can be resolved quickly. Because if not, you'll have people sitting on their hands endlessly because waiting for someone somewhere to resolve decisions. This requires continuous engagement from the decision makers. Yeah? And the Scrum solution to that is to demand a full-time member of the team who can make all decisions, called the product owner. And if you have that product owner, you've solved the problem. Unfortunately, you quite often do not have that person. And I've worked in organisations that have gone, our applicability criteria for Agile are that we have to identify this person. And if we can't, we don't do it Agile. And something like 3 to 5% of the total project volume is therefore doable Agile. Yeah. So one doesn't have to be that blunt-edged about it. There are lots and lots of ways of creating decision-making contexts where you can solve these problems other than just having the product owner. But the problem has to be solved. The other thing about ongoing decision-making is you have to be able to keep referring back to what it is you're fundamentally trying to achieve. So if we're looking at what stories we're going to pull in for the next sprint, how we're going to reprioritize things, what constitutes the simplest possible solution to the thing that we're trying to achieve today, we constantly have to be referring back to what it is we're fundamentally trying to achieve. So in an Agile project, we need to be very, very clear about what our objectives and goals are. Every proper project has always had a business case and a well-defined list of goals that you're trying to achieve. And if you're really lucky, they'll actually be measured at the end. I don't know whether this is the right room to say that kind of thing in. But in an Agile project, we need them in a much more detailed way, and we're going to use them on a daily basis, certainly on an iteration by iteration basis, to make key decisions about what we're doing. And we'll be revisiting it all the time. And also, we've got these feedback loops in. So our decision-making process, because we're delaying our decisions, we're making decisions based on more information. The classic problem with the traditional approach is, when do you make all of your decisions? You make them at the beginning. When do you know least? At the beginning. How many projects do you get through where you say, if I'd known that at the time, I wouldn't have made that decision? Mostly 100%. Right, so this is a mechanism that enables us to make decisions later based on more and better information. So I'm going to summarise all of that in a useful diagram. So 4 key areas. When do we do things? We do things based on iterations and what are we doing? Well, we're doing things in the product backlog. Why are we doing them? Because we've got our goals and objectives that we're trying to achieve, and we've got a mapping between them. Who are doing things? Well, we've got a collaborative team, acting as a team, not a set of individuals. And how are we doing things? Well, we've got things that would move the fear of change. So that's not saying anything new, particularly it's just representing it in diagrammatic form. One of the reasons it's laid out like this is the 2 things at the bottom are basically about enabling Agile, enabling a continuous iterative incremental process. The 2 things at the top are about taking advantage of the fact that you've enabled it. So why is this a good thing? That's what it is. Why is it a good thing? So these are the benefits that we're looking for, and as I said at the beginning, these are quite often the benefits that people don't necessarily find that they've achieved. The first is we want to be responsive to business drivers. Now what that means is that the business drivers at the start of a project are not necessarily the same business drivers 3 months in, 6 months in, 2 years in. But because we have built into the process the opportunity to reevaluate and potentially shoot off in a different direction, we can take that into account. Generally speaking, we provide an opportunity for early return on investment. Because we're getting to complete deliverables as quickly as possible, we will have something deployable, useful, usable much earlier in the project than completing the whole project. So in the general case, you get early return on investment. And if you don't get that, you broadly speaking get reduced risk. Because even if you haven't done everything you thought you were going to do, you've done something and it is complete. One of the key benefits is customer satisfaction. Now, why do you get customer satisfaction? Because you've worked with them all the way through. and you are building a solution that demonstrably and provably has been validated to do what it is that they were trying to do in the first place, rather than one which was spec'd and may or may not achieve that later on. Productivity is an interesting one. Right. Personally, I tend not to promote Agile if the only reason people want it is productivity. I see that if you achieve cost neutrality, then that's probably about right. You get all the other benefits, it doesn't cost you any more. And the reason is that collaborative working can be highly productivity improving. Yeah? So the best I've ever seen as a team go double its productivity within 5 to 6 weeks. People have quoted better figures, and I've certainly seen 1.5 times, lots and lots of times. And that's significant cost reduction. The other side of the coin, though, is all those other things I was talking about in terms of rework and additional regression testing and all of these kind of things. Yeah? Just broadly speaking, there are counterbalances. So I wouldn't overplay the productivity coin. And build quality. Right? You naturally get better build quality. Why? Because you keep changing things so regularly that you have to intrinsically concentrate on build quality to make it work. We talk about better than production quality as a requirement of Agile. So the whole production quality thing becomes a non-entity. That's easy, trivial. So these are the kind of benefits that we're looking for. And then we get a whole bunch of challenges. Right? So Agile is good at those things, but it's quite problematic at these things. So if things are constantly changing, what does commitment mean? Right? In a traditional world, you generally commit to a defined solution. That's the way that commitment typically works. You've got a spec that says this is the detailed solution that we're going to deliver. Yeah? And if that doesn't achieve the business goal, that's someone else's problem. Right? We've committed to that. In an Agile world, we don't want to create that commitment because we don't want to write that spec in its totality up front, and we want to allow things to change. So what do we do instead? So commitment is quite difficult. There are answers to these. I'm not going to go into that today, but I think it's only fair to talk about what is difficult. I've already talked about the fact that during your initiation there's this desire for sufficiency. What does that mean? How much time and effort do you spend? And one of the interesting developments going on in general is Agile discovery projects, right? Which kind of seems like an oxymoron, really, in that you're not directly producing any value because you're producing documents. But if you're doing product evaluation, for example, you want to choose between several products, and you have to go out and sort out at a high level what your broad requirements are going to be and how you're going to evaluate those different products. You can't just start building something. Then these kind of things start becoming interesting and valid. One of the big challenges is a lack of sense of control. So in the work that we've done, we've gone out, talked to lots and lots of organisations, senior management, project officers, these kind of people, and they go, those Agile projects, yes, they do lots of really good stuff and it's exciting and fast and really good quality, but we have no control over them whatsoever. Right? Now, again, there's no particular reason why that should be, apart from the fact that they don't really sit easily within existing control mechanisms, governance mechanisms. Therefore, what tends to happen is, while people are trialling them, they get an exemption. Go away, try that thing, forget about our standard control processes. They get an exemption. Then people start doing Agile projects in order to get an exemption. And then, eventually people go, this Agile stuff, it's out of control, what's going on? It does not have to be like that. There are ways of building control mechanisms around it. And then one of the other significant things is Agile dealing with large, complex problems. Right? So think about this. There are lots of large government projects that have gone wrong, that have been highly publicised, involving hundreds of people, billions of pounds, huge complex systems. And there's a sort of feeling, a natural feeling, that somehow or other a more agile approach would do better. Right? But we are not talking about having a small team of people with one list of staff just working through it, and a bit of let's just get started and build something and we'll be fine. Yeah, that is not how you're going to deliver a multi-billion-pound project. And I want to address very specifically how to look at things differently in a way that does deal with large and complex problems. And my final challenge is that you can do all of those things I've already talked about. You can have a product backlog, you can run iterations, you can have your daily stand-ups, and you can have people who aren't developers or testers but team players. You can do all of those things and still not be doing Agile effectively, certainly not be getting the benefits. So how do you look at it instead? Just check the time. So, our view is that Agile is not something that you do. It is not a choice. It's not, do we do this waterfall or do we do it Agile? Our view is that there are characteristics of the problem space that you're trying to deal with that lead you to choose a more waterfall type approach or a more extreme Agile approach. Right? But they're all balances. It's all balances. And those three things are how collaborative you're going to be, right? And to a certain extent, the opposite of collaboration is delegation. And it is quite clear that there is very few situations where you can be totally 100% collaborative. The only real situations I can think of are startup companies where the CEO who owns the business is in the same room dealing with the same things as the developers developing the thing they're trying to develop. Yeah? That's totally collaborative. Nothing's been delegated anywhere. But that's a pretty unusual situation. People broadly understand collaboration without much explanation. The other two are more interesting, and I'm going to come on to those. But just dealing with this first of all. This is what a lot of people see Agile being. Yeah, and it's part of it, but it's a very small part of it. Yeah, and the basic idea is that you can achieve fantastic, amazing things if you get people with the right knowledge, skill, behaviour. Yeah, that's a sort of litany, and those are all deep subjects in their own right. And you put them in a space, give them a clear goal, and remove everything that stops them getting on with what they need to get on with. Yeah, and if you do that, then amazing things can happen. And that's got nothing to do with IT. It's got nothing to do with business change or anything like that. All the same stuff applies in engineering, and there's all sorts of examples of how people have got, organised people in this kind of way. Yeah. But that's only part of what it's about. Right, the other two things are really significant. So the first is, how big are your batch sizes? So we call them batch sizes because you start off with something that's completely self-consistent and working. Right? And you break it. You break it by making changes to it. And then eventually, you've broken it a lot, you start bringing it back together again. Now, in software development terms, that's called testing. Yeah, it's a sort of pulling that together again. And once you've pulled it back together, you're at a new point where you've got a complete self-consistent solution. Right? Now, the same thing applies whether you're talking traditionally or Agile. It's just that traditionally, those batches are very large. We call them projects. Yeah, that's the definition of a project. You've got something which is in a stable existing state, which might be nothing, and you do lots of work, then you bring it all back together again, and then you've got a complete project. Right? Now, what's interesting about traditional projects is, because those batches are really large, and there's only one of them, then all of your control processes and your visibility and your planning and your understanding is what's going on inside that batch. The other extreme is to think of lots of really small batches. Yeah? And the real art of Agile is to find small batches where no one thought they existed. Yeah? And that's probably what I spend most of my time doing. And so we turn it much more into a flow, a continuous flow through the system of relatively small things. But the characteristics of each of those small things is exactly the same. We start off with a stable, self-consistent, complete thing. We break it, bring it back together again, and we've got a new, stable, complete, self-consistent thing. Yeah? And again, our ability to progress an agile project well, without creating unplanned work and so on, is closing things down effectively, completely. So we've got two extremes, but I said it's a balance. Right? So if you think about traditional projects, well, we don't always have one batch. Sometimes we start thinking in terms of phase delivery. So we've started increasing the number of batches, reducing the size of them. We start thinking about things like, are our batches of budget the same as our release batches? Yeah? They don't have to be. Yeah? Do we budget 3 phases, or do we budget each phase one at a time? Yeah? That's an interesting question. Phases are still probably typically many months, so can we make something smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller? How small can we fundamentally make these things? So, one of the things that causes agile projects to not be agile at all is to not define proper increments. Those things on the list are just a bunch of tasks. What you've actually got is one big batch, with a bunch of tasks that when you've done all of those tasks, you've got something. But until you've done all of them, you don't have anything at all. Yeah? That is a very common problem. This again has got absolutely nothing to do with IT specifically. Any problem space and any solution space, you can start asking questions about what are your opportunities for incremental delivery. So the thing about creating small batches and then sorting out what order you're going to put them in is a question of value. Right, so each one of these batches should in principle be creating a new system or new solution which is more valuable. Right. Now, if you're dealing with very small things, that value can be quite hard to justify, see. So you start getting into quite deep and meaningful questions about what value means to the people that value means something to. And that is a profound and positive conversation. The final thing is how we deal with uncertainty. So the key characteristic of many types of projects, including IT projects, is at the beginning there's lots of stuff we don't know. Right? Now, the old adage says, fail to prepare, prepare to fail. Right? We absolutely need to prepare. And prepare in this context, I'm talking about designing things, analysing, designing. But we don't necessarily have to do all the preparation before all the doing. Right? Now, in a traditional world, that is the underlying assumption. We have a phase in the process where we do certain kinds of uncertainty resolution. And we don't move out of that phase into the next phase until we've convinced ourselves that we've resolved all of those uncertainties. Now, what's quite interesting about that is that one of the ways of resolving uncertainty is to get someone to sign it off. Yeah? Is it A or B? I don't know. Just push it up the line until someone's prepared to accept the responsibility of saying it's A. Or both. So actually, the interesting thing about when and where you resolve uncertainty is you can clearly increase project risk by resolving uncertainty too late, but you also increase project risk by resolving uncertainty too early. Yeah, that goes back to making decisions when you don't have the information to make them on. So an optimal mechanism will not automatically assume you resolve all uncertainty in one place, nor will it automatically assume that you don't have to worry about it at all. It will all just come out in the wash at some point in the future, which is a definite flaw of many Agile projects. It is somewhere in the middle, and the easiest and most effective way to deal with it is to be explicit about what your headline uncertainties are, and to look at the impact of not resolving them or not fully resolving them, and creating a plan for resolving those uncertainties. So any particular project is a certain amount about building solution. And Agile is very, very focused on building solutions, but it can be equally 50% about resolving uncertainty. And yet that's kind of overlooked in the standard process. So going back to the balances, it's how much are we collaborating, how small are the batches that we can identify, how many of them are there, and what is the optimal way of managing uncertainty. It's not all up front, it's not all down there, somewhere in the middle, in a structured way. So that's Agile. Easy. So the applicability piece, right, it's worth just saying, why has Agile come out of IT? Because a lot of that's not specific to IT. Now, we've already talked about the fact that on the cost of change side, there are new practices that exist, and there's been an awful lot of tooling. And that all makes it very cost effective. But the thing in bold is what it's fundamentally about. Right? It is fundamentally hard to resolve your uncertainty up front. It generally does not work. Right? So lots and lots of people have adopted Agile, not because they've looked at Agile and gone, we understand that and we can see how brilliant it is and we know how to do it. They've adopted it because what they've been doing before is so god-awful that they've got to do something else, and anything is probably going to be somewhat better. And the reason it's so awful is they try and resolve the uncertainty up front, they build everything, and then they've got to deal with all those incorrect assumptions. And it costs money and time and so on. Those are the headline things. What are the opportunities for collaboration? Well, small teams can achieve huge amounts. There are some interesting challenges to the Agile model, because it's quite hard to collaborate with offshore teams, for example, and that's quite endemic to IT. So these are kind of considerations. Opportunity for incremental value. Well, IT systems evolve over time anyway. There are very few IT systems that you deliver and then they just stay the same forever. So if they can evolve after you deliver them, why can't they evolve before you deliver them? It's just the same thing, surely. And you've demonstrated the cost of change, it means that they can keep evolving. So that kind of seems to make sense why it's come out of IT. But what does this mean in terms of putting it in the wider context? Right? So now we're coming back to business change. Right? Doing an IT system, we're trying to be incremental, we're trying to resolve uncertainty at the best possible time, but it's in a wider context. And this is where the problems start. Right? So if IT is thinking incrementally and the customer is thinking single batch, a very, very common pattern, right, you'll get some benefit because you'll get some feedback loops and some opportunity to change things a bit, and you get all that kind of stuff. But broadly speaking, you're not going to get early return investment, you're not going to reduce your risk, there's all sorts of things that aren't going to happen. Much more fundamentally, if the business side, the customer side, is not interested in the uncertainty, and they go, that's your problem, I don't want to talk about the uncertainty stuff, right? That's all your problem, then what do? Right? There's only two things you can do. One is you can go away and resolve it all, so that you can come back with, let's say, a fixed cost, which is within limits, because you've answered all the questions, Right, so just a question, how much is it going to cost with an expectation of degrees of accuracy forces kinds of uncertainty resolution that you don't want. Or alternatively, the other pattern that is quite common is that they are going through their own process of resolving all of their uncertainties. So examples I can think of, sort of working on insurance products, for example. Yeah, here's a new insurance product. Yes, we can see this incremental plan of how to build it. Yeah, and we can release this thing and that'll be valuable, and we can measure the customers using it, we can do all that kind of stuff. But then there's this whole FSA regulation thing over here. Right? So in order to satisfy compliance, they want to state exactly what the final end state of the product is going to be and have it approved. Yeah? So they're going to do all their uncertainty resolution design work up front. Right? And then they've kind of lost interest in all the other incremental stuff because they know what the end game is going to be and it can't change. Yeah, so what's the point really? Just go away and do it, please. Yeah, so these are the kind of challenges. Now, what's interesting about that is that FSA compliance is something, as an example, where there's a huge amount of inherent uncertainty and a huge amount of opportunity for incremental delivery. Yeah, so working with financial organisations, for example, they'll have a compliance officer who, as a starting point, if you do all of your resolution up front, as a starting point, will list everything that they possibly think might cause them to fail. Yeah, some of them 100% it will, some of them 5% it will. Yeah, some of them you would find heavily if you got, if you were wrong. Some of them you just get asked to sort it out if you are wrong, and you're not even sure that you are going to be wrong. It's not an exact science. So there's a huge amount of uncertainty, and there's significant opportunities to deliver the important stuff first, and then start incrementally building on top of it. And that's in a situation that had driven people to do all of their upfront business design stuff early on. And then the same thing applies to collaboration. That's fairly straightforward. So for me the key thing is the reason why those three things, collaboration, batch size, incremental delivery, uncertainty management, are important is that these are the messages that we have found work when you go to business owners, people involved in business change, people involved in business level decisions, and explain to them why their world is going to be different if they're thinking agile, if they're involved in agile. Yeah, going to them talking about sprints and product backlogs and daily stand-ups, whatever. Yeah, the thing that's fundamentally different is, what does collaboration mean from your point of view? Right? What does early value mean? We understand the value of the end game, but how can we deliver value on an ongoing basis? What would that actually mean and look like? And where and when and how are we going to resolve the uncertainties? Yeah, those are the big questions. So, I started off by saying that the wide topic of business change is not my fundamental expertise. Right? So I think the headline things, in my experience so far, is that it is equally difficult to resolve uncertainty up front. And why is that? Why is it hard for IT in the first place? It's hard for IT because you are assuming that how people are going to interact with the system. You're making big assumptions. And people, being people, tend to not act according to the way you think they are. And that can be very true from a business change point of view as well, from a business process point of view, for example. Anything that involves people is really hard to predict, and there are lots of assumptions and it needs testing. The thing that's going to make it hard, though, is, like with the example of the training stuff, is the tools to make cost of change cheap don't necessarily exist at the moment. And part of the reason they don't exist is because there isn't a market for them. So which comes first? So it kind of means that one has to work on things large enough to be able to fund your own investment in tools. So it's doable, but the first point is starting to think about cost of change, not just achieving a job, but how you can continue changing it once you've done it. And the other thing, and I think it's a whole subject area for thinking and research, is doing things to make people more tolerant of change. Yeah. So again, it's one of these things where you can just assert people will not accept that level of change. But I think it's interesting to challenge those kind of ideas and go, well, why not, and what can we do to make that different? So finally, in terms of personal real experience, the thing for me, the major thing that happens when you move from just doing IT into doing business change, when we're doing this kind of, we're going to help you, business, do your job, without actually saying that, is modelling objectives. It's modelling the value proposition. It's providing a map from what it is we're trying to achieve to the solution we think is going to achieve it. And that's something that people don't normally think through. And if we're successful at drawing a good picture of that people understand and can refer back to, and it helps drive decisions, then a whole bunch of things come out. So first of all, business objectives are hierarchical. Right, so first at the top says we want to make more money. The next person down says, how are we going to make more money? Well, one way is to reduce cost. Now we've got an objective to reduce cost. How are we going to reduce cost? Well, one way of doing that is to improve our system, IT systems, to reduce cost. But there are other ways as well. We could change the business processes or hire cheaper people or whatever. Right? Then take one of those. There's an objective. Right, let's hire cheaper people. So what are we going to do? Yeah, so objective solution, and that's a new objective solution, each one of those links is an assumption. Yeah, we think to achieve that, doing that will work. Assumptions demand experiments to validate. They're uncertainties. We need to start thinking about how to resolve those uncertainties. So it's a way of making explicit things that aren't necessarily that obvious. We can build into that model points of measurement. So here's an objective, how are we going to measure that? Not all of those objectives are measurable, but many of them are. We can start building into our delivery process as we take small increments and chunk off. We can start building a measurement process to see whether or not that thing that we thought would deliver results actually does. We're never going to get it always right, but what we can do is start looking to minimize our waste by avoiding building things that are not useful, don't deliver the intended value, weren't specific to the thing that we're actually trying to achieve. Yeah. So I've worked in areas where we've been able to measure the amount of work requested prior to and post doing this kind of stuff, and the answer is roughly, in this particular case, was roughly about 50% of the work being requested did not deliver the intended value. Right? So that's 50% of the work. So while before that, all the focus was on how can we build things faster? How can we churn more, make things happen faster? That became irrelevant. It was how can we get better at choosing the right things to build. And I think that was it. Thank you very much. Sorry, 5 minutes over.